Boethius, Consolation of Philosophy, Book 2. This chapter is about fortune. Lady Philosophy diagnoses Boethius' problem is that he longs for his previous good fortune. What is fortune? Fortune is chance or luck as it affects human affairs. So good fortune would be like saying good luck, and bad fortune means you have bad luck. Bad things happen to you. So Lady Philosophy's initial diagnosis for Boethius is that he longs for his good fortune to return. He had good fortune, he lost it, he wants it back. But fortune is also embodied in this story by, just like philosophy is, it's embodied by a person called, and fortune is a pagan goddess who basically controls people's fortunes, whether they be good or bad. And the way she does this is by spinning a wheel. And people are kind of attached to the wheel. And as they go around, they go up. They ascend in their careers and become maybe knights and squires, and then they become a king. And then they become old, or they lose power, and they fall down, they go to jail, things like that. That's bad fortune. So you go up, you go down. But the reality is everybody's going to go up and down, right? You're not going to stay up forever. And so fortune is like a wheel. Lady Philosophy says that fortune is like a cat that toys with men, or with mice, before killing them. She says you think that fortune's attitude towards you has changed or gotten worse, but it hasn't. She is constant in her inconstancy. She's always been fickle, and any visit of good fortune is a sure sign of misery to come. Reading from the book, it says, fortune is, of course, a monster, and she toys with those for whom she intends catastrophe, showing her friendly face and lifting them up before dashing them down when they least are prepared for it. You think that fortune's attitude towards you has changed, but you're wrong. She hasn't changed a bit. She was always whimsical, and she remains constant in her inconstancy. You were wrong to take her smiles seriously and to rely on them as the basis for your happiness. The visit of the unreliable goddess, that's fortune, is a sure sign of misery to come. And then she gives some examples. If you spread your sails before the wind, then you must go where the wind takes you, and not where you might wish to go. If you wish to try farming, and sow your seeds in the earth, then you must expect barren years, as well as years of abundance. Would you presume to stop her wheel from turning? So in other words, nothing can stop bad things from happening. You can't make good things happen all the time in your life. You'll have the good and you'll have the bad, and the wheel turns, and you don't have complete control over that situation. There's a poem at the end of this chapter about fortune and her wheel. With an indifferent hand she spins the wheel, and one or another number comes up lucky, while the only constant is change. Mighty kings are brought low, and the weeping face of the conquered is lifted, but for only a moment, as if to mock him. It's a game she plays, and a demonstration of the ruthless power, a way to keep her devotees in total subjugation, raising men up and then dashing them down in ruin. Book 2, Chapter 2, Fortune's Side of the Story. Lady Philosophy now takes Fortune's side and argues her case for Boethius. She says that Fortune has not taken his possessions or done him any harm. Fortune was kind to him, in fact, for most of his life. He thought that was his right, to have her favors. Now that she has taken back some of those favors which she gave him, he should be thankful for the use of what he had when he had it. But instead, he's upset because he's lost those things that were never really his. But Fortune is the owner of these things, not Boethius. Fortune must turn the wheel. It goes up, but must come down. He has had more than his share of good fortune, and her inconstancy, that is, Fortune's inconstancy, should give him hope of more good fortune in the future, possibly. Reading a little bit of this, Fortune says, "What harm have I done to you? What possessions of yours have I taken? When nature brought you out of your mother's womb, you were naked, poor, and helpless, and I accepted you and was kind to you. That is why you are now angry with me. You took it as if it were your right. Now that I have taken it back, you ought to thank me for the use of what was always mine anyways. If those things that you complain about losing were really yours, you'd still have them. But they were mine, and I had the owner's right to them, which I chose to exercise. And I turn it so that what is low is raised high, and what is brought down, and what is up is brought down. You ascend, fine, but you must acknowledge that it can't be wrong, for you have to descend again." Then she gives some examples of people who, we're on page 32 now. We give some examples of people whose fortunes turned on them. She gives the example of Lydia, who was burnt alive, and at first he was a powerful king who was able to lead an army against Cyrus, the emperor of Persia. Then he was put on a pyre to be burnt alive as a prisoner, but was saved by a rain shower. So his fortune changed twice. Then she also gives the example of King Perses on the coin down below here, of Macedonia, who was the king of the Greeks, fought a war against the Romans, lost it, and Greece was made a province or a colony of the Roman Empire. She says, "You have had more than your share of good things that I can give, but even now I have not deserted you entirely, for my mutability still gives you reason to hope for better things to come." Okay, chapter 3. In misfortune, you should appreciate your blessings. This is Lady Philosophy's advice about the ill fortune that Boethius is suffering. He's lost his freedom, he's in prison, he may be going to his own death, but she says he should be grateful for the good things that he still has and that he already had. For instance, he was an orphan, but he was fostered by the family of the highest rank in Rome. He also got to marry into that family. His sons became joint consuls. Consul is like becoming president of the United States in the Roman Empire. And this was one of the happiest days of his life. Most men would never have their sons become a consul, but he had two sons that both became consul at the same time. She says, "Be thankful for what you had and for what you still have." This is the first time that fortune has even been bad to you, she says. All men lose their good fortune eventually, so this is not unique. When they die, everybody loses it. Nothing in life lasts forever. Okay, I'm going to read you a few passages from this chapter, which is chapter 3 of book 2. The world called you the happiest of men, married into such a family with a chaste and loving wife and with the blessing of 2 fine sons. And the memory of that spectacular day when you saw your 2 sons carried from your house to ascend to their joint consulship. That was the day they took their seats in the curule chairs in the Senate to hear you deliver your oration in honor of the king. You had nothing but praise then for the works of fortune when she was coddling you as her pet. And now you want to reckon up your accounts with her? This is the first time she has shown you anything other than a beatific smile. Balance out the good things and the bad that have happened to you in your life, and you will have to acknowledge that you are still way ahead. You are unhappy because you have lost things in which you took pleasure, but you can take comfort in the likelihood that what is now making you miserable will also pass away. Every man who never has the kind of catastrophe that befell you comes to the last day of his life, when he sees that his good fortune is finally ending. And do you suppose it makes any difference to him at such a moment whether good fortune is leaving him or he is leaving good fortune? The last part of the chapter 3, there's a poem about Phoebus, who drives a chariot that pulls the sun across the sky. When Phoebus from his chariot spreads light through the looming sky, his bright flame overwhelms the twinkle of stars. When Zephyr's gentle breath warm warms the springtime rosebud, but a sudden storm from the south can strip the bushes to bare thorns. As with fleeting pleasures of men, a stern law decrees that nothing in life lasts. So this is an example of how he uses mythology as part of his poetry and as part of the work, just in the same way that he's using Greek. He's using Greek philosophy of Plato and other Greek philosophers. He's also using the mythology of the Greeks. Okay, chapter 4 of book 2 is in misfortune. So chapter 4 of book 2 talks about how misfortune is not absolute if you still have some of your most precious possessions. This is on page 37. So Boethius still has his father-in-law, his wife, and his 2 sons, who are consuls, are still safe. Men, she said, Lady Philosophy says, men are concerned for their own life, but some things, like the safety of their family, are more precious than life itself. On page 39, she says that good fortune is never possessed completely. Everyone has something to worry about, and often others don't see it. And here he gives some examples of worries. Reading on page 39, good fortune is not something we possess entirely or forever. One man owns a lot of property and is prosperous enough, but he is ashamed of his undistinguished forebears. Another is of high birth, but never goes anywhere because he is ashamed of how poor he is. A third is both well-born and rich enough, but he is unmarried. And a fourth, happily married, is miserable because he has not been blessed with children, and he knows that his estate will therefore pass on to someone else's children. And then a fifth, who has children, is unhappy because his sons or daughters have not turned out well and have disappointed him. There is hardly anyone who is without something to fret about, and almost always people on the outside have no hint whatever of what is troubling the hearts and souls of their friends or associates. And then he goes on to say that happiness is to be found inside of yourself. If you have yourself, then you have what you don't want to lose and fortune can't take. So good fortune can't supply happiness because good fortune can be taken away at any time, and you're worried about losing it, and worry robs you of happiness. So reading a little bit more from the book here on page 40, why then do men look outside themselves for happiness when it is sure to be found inside? Is there anything more precious to you than yourself? No, certainly not. But if you are in possession of yourself, then you have that which you don't want to lose, and which fortune cannot take away from you. If happiness is the highest good of a rational man, and if whatever can be taken away cannot be the highest good, because that which can't be taken away must be a higher good, then it makes no sense to say that good fortune can supply happiness. A rich man can't be happy because he is worried about losing everything at any moment, and this continual fear will keep him from being happy. And then at the end of chapter 4, there's a poem about building a house on a rock. This is similar to the Bible parable about building a house on a rock versus a house on sand. Here's part of the poem. He who would build a sturdy house he intends will last, that will not be destroyed by the forces of winds and waves. Build upon a low rock, where you're safe from the gales and thunder, and far from turbulent sea, where no one is ever secure. Within the strength of your walls you have some hope of survival, and may smile at the hostile skies. Book 2, Chapter 5. What if the gifts of fortune were not temporary? Do they have value then? This is on page 43. Riches are only good to share or use. That's the only good they have, is the use that we put them to. We can either give them to people as gifts, or we can use them to buy things. But there's actually no value in just owning riches and just owning money. It's kind of like the idea of, in Beowulf, of the dragon sitting on the treasure, right? He has the treasure, but he doesn't do anything with it, and so he never actually benefits from it. Jewels are pretty, but their beauty has nothing to do with those who own them or admire them. The countryside, or nature, is also beautiful, but no one can claim that beauty for himself, as it really doesn't belong to you. The fruits of the earth are good for nourishment, and you should eat what you need, but there's no point in having more of them than needed, right? They're just going to go bad. And clothing is not really part of a person. It doesn't indicate a good person. Good clothing doesn't indicate a good person. It just indicates a good tailor. So men think that they need lots of things, but other creatures are content with what God provides for them. And then at the end of that chapter, there is a poem also. And this poem, that man was better in simpler times, before gold and war preoccupied his mind. How happy were men long ago when they were content with nature and not yet corrupted by wealth. Their hungers were easily sated by acorns they found on the ground. They had not yet learned to mix sweet honey into their wine. They did not dress up in silks, dyed with bright Tyrian purple. They fell asleep on the grass and drank from a nearby stream. In the hot noons they would sit in the shade of a towering pine. They did not chop down these trees to fashion the keels of boats, to sail on the seas and venture to unknown shores and peoples. No bugle calls then had sounded to summon men to bloodshed, in hatred or naked greed, that stained the fields with blood, for what could men gain from killing? Look at us now and compare our lives to those of the ancients. As fierce as the fires of Etna is the lust of men for plunder. Shame, shame on man, who first dug gold from the earth and brought the bright baubles of jewelers into the light of the sun. Chapter 6 is about high offices and how people want to get into positions of power. Powerful positions don't make good men, and a man of virtue is not honored by being in a high office. The high office is honored by his virtue. Here's straight from the book. It is not that a man of virtue is honored because of high office, but rather than that the office is honored because of his virtue. He then goes on to say that if you saw a mouse that somehow claimed to have authority over all the other mice, what are men anyway, when you come right down to it, but relatively weak creatures? What power does one man exert over another except over his body, or over what is even of less worth than his body, which is to say, his fortune? A free mind cannot be commanded. So in other words, powerful positions can give you power over men's bodies and their fortunes, but you can never command somebody's mind, tell them and force them to think what you want them to think. If high offices were inherently good, her argument goes, then evil men would never be able to attain them, because they would, because they are not inherently good, they wouldn't be able to get into an inherently good thing. And so the high offices themselves are not inherently good. Also, attaining high office doesn't, often people that are trying to get into high office have a lot of vices like avarice and greed. And getting into the high office doesn't get rid of these vices. It doesn't get rid of the avarice and greed and other vices. Fortune comes to the good and the bad alike, not just the good. So a little more directly from the book, if those offices and their powers had anything inherently good in them, they would never be possessed by wicked men. But riches do not get rid of avarice, nor can power give a man moderation and self-control if power is what he lusts after. High office, then, when it is given to a dishonest man, does not make him worthy of it, but rather displays his unworthiness to the world. Fortune has nothing whatever to do with goodness, since she does not confine herself to good men, nor does she make good those who enjoy her favors. The poem at the end is about how power corrupts. We know how the heart of man is savage when cities are blazing and senators killed, when brother murders brother, his hand dripping with their mother's gore. Nero, by the way, killed his own mother. How could Nero, the emperor, look at her cold corpse with dry eyes and praise its beauty, but his scepter extended its influence throughout the world, to the westering waves, to the lands in the east where the sun rises and the Great Bear looks down with indifference. And the south wind, and the south with the desert's sweltering sands, could all this power restrain his madness, sharp as a sword and bitter as poison? So, in other words, Nero was the emperor of the entire Roman Empire, but it didn't make him a good person. He was utterly evil, killing his own mother, committing all kinds of other crimes before being killed himself. Chapter 7 of Book 2. Fame is insubstantial and doesn't last. So Lady Philosophy says that basically that fame doesn't spread very far. It's usually just restricted to your own country. It doesn't last very long. People don't usually remember famous people much after they're gone. From the book here it says, each person then must be content to be known within the boundaries of his own country. Think also of how many people famous in their own time are altogether forgotten now. Even if your fame were to last a millennium, we were speaking of, that would mean nothing, not just small, but absolutely non-existent. Then she tells a story about a guy that thought he was a philosopher. The book says, you thought you were a philosopher. This is on page 54. But let me tell you a story. There was a man who made such a claim, not from dedication to the truth and reason, but out of vanity, as a way of enhancing his reputation. Somebody came along to taunt him and suggested that he was a fraud. And this critic said that he would believe the claim that the man was a philosopher if he could bear all unjust injuries that fate heaped upon him in calm and silence. Then he would admit that the fellow was a philosopher. Well, the other one adopted a patient manner, and for months, and even years, bore up under the insults and injuries of life. And then he asked his challenger, now, do you admit that I am a philosopher? To which the reply was, I would have, if you had kept silent. But if there is a mind that is let loose at last from the earthly prison and is free to return to the heavenly home, will it care any longer about mere earthly affairs? Will it not rather, in its seat on high, prefer to rejoice in its liberation from mundane things? The final point there is that fame won't matter to a soul after death. So in the final chapter of Book 2, Lady Philosophy makes the claim that bad fortune is actually better for a man than good fortune, because bad fortune shows the true nature of fortune, that it can't be trusted, and therefore it is instructive to man. It shows how fragile is the happiness of mortals, and bad fortune shows men what the world is really like and who your real friends are. False friends will desert you in bad fortune. Real friends will stick with you. So now I want to talk briefly about Stoicism as it relates to Christianity. So a lot of the ideas that Boethius is going over here in this in chapter 2 regarding fortune are strongly related to a philosophy of the ancient world called Stoicism. Here's a summary of some of its things. Recognize what you cannot control. You determine your reaction to a crisis. You don't have to get upset. You don't have to do crazy things. You should ignore people dominated by their own negative emotions. Master yourself and aim to be virtuous, and learn to move on. Don't dwell on bad things. Here's a quote from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Do not dream of possession of what you do not have. Rather, reflect on the greatest blessing in what you do have, and on their account remind yourself how much they would have been missed if they were not there. So this might remind you of some of Lady Philosophy's advice during this this chapter about being thankful for what you do have, even in bad circumstances. So Stoicism is a philosophy that originated in ancient Greece and Rome, and it's based on the idea that virtue is enough to achieve a well-lived life. Virtue. So being a good person is the key aspect of a well-lived life. Some key aspects of Stoicism include distinguishing between what is and isn't in control. So Stoics believe that while we can't always control the events that affect us, they might be beyond our control, we can control how we respond to these events, our own behavior, our own response. We can choose to get upset, to be depressed, or we can choose to accept them, all right? And this kind of might remind you of some of the advice of Lady Philosophy towards the end there, talking about how sometimes bad fortune is better for us than good fortune. Another principle of Stoicism is practicing virtue. Stoics believe that pursuing excellence of character and cultivating feelings of kinship with all humans are important. Also, mental preparation. Stoics believe in mentally rehearsing undesirable events to prepare for them, thinking about the worst things that could happen, so that when they do, you're not so surprised by them. There's a saying that I like, which is, but expect the worst. Other principles of Stoicism are avoiding gossip and whining. So Stoics believe that these behaviors should be avoided. Living in the moment. Stoics believe that living life only in regard to the future, always planning for the future, is a mistake, as we can only directly experience the present. So you might think about somebody that maybe saves up lots of money for the future, and then they retire, and what happens? They die the next week, right? That often does happen, and so it's important to appreciate the moment, right? To realize that the only thing we really have is right now. So dealing with the world as it is another Stoic principle. Stoics believe that we should try to deal with the world as it is rather than imagining an ideal society. So it's nice to try to make the world a better place, but it's also important to realize, and in their minds anyways, that the world is never going to be perfect, right? We have to deal with it the way it is. So in a lot of ways, you can see how these ideas are kind of closely linked to a lot of ideas that Christians might have based on their faith. And this is why there's been a lot of writers, including Boethius, who seem to evoke Stoic ideas in their writings. Today, the term Stoic, when you call somebody a Stoic today, you usually mean that someone remains calm under pressure and avoids emotional extremes. Famous philosophers that were Stoics include Epictetus, who was the father of Stoicism, Zeno, Seneca, who was Nero's philosopher in Rome, and the emperor of Rome, Marcus Aurelius, during the 3rd century AD, who wrote the Meditations and is probably the most famous of the Stoic philosophers. His Meditations are still read by Christians today, interestingly, in fairly large amounts. Marcus Aurelius said, whenever you are about to find fault with someone, ask yourself the following question: what fault of mine most nearly resembles the one I am about to criticize? This might remind you of Jesus' quote of, do not judge lest you be judged, and before you remove the thorn from your neighbor's eye, remove the log first from your own. And here's another one: do every act of your life as though it were the very last act of your life. Probably great advice for a Christian too. So Stoicism versus Christianity, what are the differences? Well, one is that Christianity is a religion, right? And Stoicism is more of a philosophy. But Stoicism and Christianity differ in many ways, including their core beliefs, goals, and views on suffering. The core beliefs of Stoicism is a Hellenistic philosophy that focuses on personal virtue and wisdom, while Christianity is a monotheistic religion that centers on the life of Jesus Christ. The goals of Stoics aim to achieve happiness and self-realization through moral virtue and serenity, while Christians aim to be conformed into the image of Christ and share in God's rule on earth. So, views on suffering. Stoics believe that suffering is a natural part of life and that we can control our reactions to it, while Christians often understand suffering within the context of sin, redemption, and God's plan. So you can see there are some clear differences in beliefs here. relationship with the logos, or the word. In Stoicism, the logos, which is the Greek word for word, is an unknowable force, while in Christianity, the word, or the logos, was made flesh and dwelt among us. The logos is Jesus Christ. Human nature. Stoics believe that nature has instilled people with the capacity to reason, while Christians believe that people are born with original sin. And then value. Stoics believe that one's value is wrapped up in effort or achievement, while Christians believe that all humans possess equal value as image bearers of God. So, the purpose of life, this is a Stoic quote here, the purpose of life is happiness, which is achieved by virtue, living according to the dictates of reason, ethical and philosophical training, self-reflection, careful judgment, and inner calm. Marcus Aurelius says, God, give me patience to reconcile with what I am not able to change, give me strength to change what I can, and give me the wisdom to distinguish one from another. This quote might seem familiar to you. There's a prayer called the Serenity Prayer, which is sometimes used today, which is very similar to this. So Stoicism and Christianity, what is the common ground between them? Obviously, they must have some things in common here, because Boethius is kind of evoking Stoicism to a certain extent in his arguments, especially in chapter 2. Stoicism and in book 2, I'm sorry. Stoicism and Christianity share some common ground, including monotheism. Both religions are monotheistic and try to follow the will of God. Personal development. Both systems emphasize self-improvement, trying to overcome sin in the case of a Christian. Personal reflection, examining your conscience, and striving for a virtuous life, trying to be holy. The common good. Stoics believe that each person has a role to play in contributing to the common good of the human race. And of course, Christians also believe that. Moral teachings. Both religions share many moral teachings, such as the golden rule, do unto others what you would have them do unto you, and the importance of loving one another. And then personal agency. Stoics believe that humans have the power to seek to live virtuously. And Epictetus believed that affirming human moral freedoms is essential to a conception of God as loving. While Christians believe similarly but differently that we can become holy, but only with God's help, with God's grace. So from Epictetus, he's considered the founding father of the Stoic philosophy, happiness and freedom begin with a clear understanding of one principle. Some things are within your control, and some things are not. And that's a true statement, right? And I think from a Christian point of view, you could say, for the things that are not in control, what do we need to do? We need to trust in God, right? And to recognize that God is in control of the world, and accept his will and his providence in life, whether good things or bad things come. So you can see how there's that could be a Stoic idea, but it could also be a Christian idea. Marcus Aurelius said, adapt yourself to the life you have been given, and truly love the people to whom destiny has surrounded you. So what is he saying here? He's saying that you need to accept the lot you're given in life and live out the life you're given. Don't try and live somebody else's life or do something that you're not able to do. A lot of people are always wanting something better than what they have. But he's saying here it's better to accept what you have and live with that lot. The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. So Stoicism is, I think, an interesting philosophy, and it's interesting to think how it relates to Christianity. I tend to think of the early in the early church fathers, there was a lot of them that were very austere, went out to the desert and lived very austere lives, with the idea that by subduing their bodies, by subduing their senses, they would be able to overcome temptation and sin. And I can't help but think that is, to a certain extent, something that kind of overlaps with Stoicism, and I think a lot of Christian ideas tend to overlap to a certain extent with Stoicism. So that's the seems to be the one of the big inspirations for Book 2 of the Consolation of Philosophy.